The People's Painter: How Ben Shahn Fought for Justice with Art, by Cynthia Levison. Pictures by Evan Turk. The People's Painter. The People's Painter: How Ben Shahn Fought for Justice with Art, by Cynthia Levison. Pictures by Evan Turk. The first thing I can remember, Ben said, I drew. From the time he could grasp a pencil, Ben Shahn yearned to draw everything he saw in his village in Lithuania. His mom Gittel's hands molding sturdy plates from slippery clay, his tat Hessel carving stout chairs out of spruce trees, and his tat's tat Zaid chiseling wooden skates so Ben could skim across the frozen Neris River. But paper was a luxury in the shtetl, and there was none to spare. So with his finger, Ben traced the Hebrew letters that curled and curved through his book of Bible stories. Then he couldn't stop himself. He sketched in the margins. Some Bible stories, though, enraged Ben, especially when good people got hurt. That's not right. Ben also protested when his seder teacher wasn't fair. After a classmate pulled a prank, the teacher kept everyone indoors, demanding the culprit's name. I'm not going to tell who did it, Ben declared, and I'm not going to pay for something I didn't do. Refusing to tattle, he walked out. Justice had mattered to Ben ever since he was little. He was only 4 when Tsar Nicholas II's soldiers hurled rocks through his window and dragged his father away, just because Tat had been demanding fair pay for working people. He was banished to frigid, far-off Siberia. Ben didn't know yet how to draw his outrage, but feeling his father's boldness inside himself, he marched up to the sentry at the end of the street and shouted, "Down with the Tsar!" The soldier chased after him, but Ben escaped. Tate eventually escaped too, and in 1906 he made his way from Siberia to America. He wrote to Gittel, "Come." 8-year-old Ben and his brother Philip, his sister Hattie, and his mama packed everything and their belongings, but Zaid could not leave the shtetl, the only home he knew. As the stagecoach pulled away, Ben had to let go of his grandfather's hand. He wailed. America bewildered the new immigrant, trains overhead and underground. A cramped 2-room tenement apartment for the whole family, a chair that rocked and nearly dumped him over backwards. Not at all like Tate's. Tomatoes, ick. And in school, Ben stared at what seemed like thousands of letters in all different shapes and styles and sizes, all different from Hebrew. Even worse, bullies tormented him about his clothes and accent. They called him names just because he was Jewish. Sometimes, though, they'd pause if he chalked their portraits on the sidewalk. No one drew people better than Ben. Seeing his craving to draw, a teacher gave him watercolors. Another paid him to pen calligraphy, elegant curving letters, all in English. By the time he was 12, Ben was determined to become an artist. To do that, he needed to finish high school, go to college, learn about colors, lines, anatomy, but his father lost his job, and when Ben turned 14, his mother ordered him to leave school and go to work. He argued bitterly, "Send Philip instead!" But his family needed whatever Ben could earn. So he apprenticed to a lithographer who had hand-lettered signs for billboards and chiseled them into stone storefronts. By day, Ben carefully copied those thousands of English letters. He spent months on A, tracing and carving every single curve and curl. Then he moved on to B. Gradually, he fell in love with these letters too. After 5 years, he mastered the craft, and his signs began to appear around the city. Meanwhile, at night, Ben went to art school, hoping to perfect his portraits. But there was a problem. Ben's teachers taught landscapes: purple, shadowed valleys, misty haystacks, fields of cows. Ben argued that shadows are not purple, and he detested cows. "I like stories and people," he explained. "Stories about people fighting injustice, about workers like Tate, loved ones like Zadie, and immigrants like himself." His teachers, though, insisted that paintings were supposed to tell stories, that pictures should be beautiful, not real life. Since he didn't want to portray pleasant pastures or cows, Ben wondered if he was an artist after all. Maybe he should only make signs. Nearly 30 years old now, confused and discouraged, he quit school, stopped painting, and sailed to Europe. Then, on to North Africa. In museums, he gazed at centuries of pictures. "This may be art, but is it my own art?" he pondered. During that time, protests over an unfair trial in America also caught Ben's eye. 2 Italian-American men, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were executed in 1927 for a murder they probably did not commit. The judge and jury decided they must be guilty since they were poor immigrants and anarchists who opposed any kind of government. "Here was something to paint," Ben later exclaimed, infuriated at the injustice. "If I am to be a painter, I must show the world how it looks through my eyes, not theirs. What shall I paint? Stories." He returned home and told their tale in 23 pictures, even though his teachers had insisted that he must not tell stories, and people flocked to see them, even if they weren't pretty. Ben didn't stop there. He painted other stories about outsiders, working people, prisoners, and Jews who had been mistreated, just like Tate. His portraits were so powerful that in 1935 the United States government hired him. It was the Great Depression, and jobs were scarce. So was food. President Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted Americans to see the poor people needed a helping hand from Washington. For this job, instead of painting on canvas, Ben borrowed a camera. With his friend Bernarda Bryson, whom he later married, he crisscrossed the countryside taking photos that revealed hard lives in troubled times. Young cotton pickers in Arkansas, impoverished families in Mississippi, manual laborers in Louisiana, child coal miners in Pennsylvania. Many people didn't know how desperate things were until they saw Ben's photo stories in schools, libraries, and magazines. They urged politicians to pass laws to make sure workers got jobs, families were fed, and children could go to school. The government hired Ben again in 1937, this time to paint a mural in a new village named Jersey Homesteads. President Roosevelt's New Deal program had built the town so garment workers, most of them Jewish, could move from city tenements into the airy countryside. What story would Ben tell? His own. In 3 scenes, he showed immigrants, including Mem, arriving poor and bewildered in America, working hard, demanding fair pay, and, finally, settling happily in Jersey homesteads. To Ben, the village felt like a shtetl. He and Bernarda liked it so much they moved there. Their children walked by the mural at school every day. While some parts of the government displayed Ben's works, others didn't trust him. In the 1940s and 50s, congressmen accused him of being disloyal because he didn't paint Purple Mountain Majesties or America the Beautiful. Instead, he shed light on Americans who live in the shadows. One wintry day, two men appeared at Ben's door and flashed their IDs. Federal Bureau of Investigation. They questioned him relentlessly. Why do you support workers? Immigrants, civil rights? Isn't America fine the way it is? Which of your friends are enemies of America? Ben politely served them tea and cake, but he refused to tattle. So the FBI threatened to deport him to Lithuania, just as the Tsar had exiled Tate to Siberia. But Ben was not disloyal. I am the most American of all American painters, he later said. Eventually, the FBI backed down. Anyway, threats had never scared Ben. I hate injustice, he had declared. For the next 16 years, Ben continued to portray stories of people clamoring for their rights. Civil rights activists, workers demanding fair pay, political protesters, advocates for peace. Americans loved Ben's art so much they called him the People's Painter. Ben drew until the end of his life, handing down his stories of injustice from generation to generation. When he was a Zaidi himself, Ben encouraged young artists to sketch everywhere, especially in the margins. Author's note. Ben Shahn was so concerned about what was happening around him that you could almost track American history from the early 1900s to the 1960s through his work. In addition to the issues raised in this book, he addressed both world wars, Social Security, the Dust Bowl, nuclear arms testing, voting rights, and the Vietnam War and health care. Art that focuses on current events is called social realism. Some congressmen considered Ben's artwork in this style unpatriotic, and he was investigated by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Nevertheless, Ben's social realist pieces are still displayed in government buildings and universities. Hugely popular, Ben was one of the youngest artists to have a retrospective exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. His shows at art galleries routinely sold out, and he was hired to create pieces for a wide variety of all purposes. Ben also sketched greeting cards, posters, advertisements, and record jackets. He decorated shipping containers at Passover Haggadah and stage sets for ballets, and he created stained glass windows for a synagogue. He designed lettering in several alphabets and wrote books titled Love and Joy about letters. Ben illustrated stories for teenage magazines, and his drawings were even used in a children's book called Ounce, Dice, Trice. As a photographer, he sometimes used a right-angle camera, which allowed him to face one direction while snapping a picture of an unsuspecting subject in another. In 1922, Ben married Tilly Goldstein, with whom he had 2 children. 10 years later, while painting a mural with Diego Rivera, Ben met Bernarda Bryson, a journalist and artist. Ben divorced Tilly. He and Bernarda later married and raised their 3 children in Jersey homesteads. In 1945, Ben helped change the town's name to Roosevelt in honor of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. School children there still study Ben's mural. One wrote in a report, "You just have to look at it and you see the story." I have long been drawn to Ben Shahn because of his fervent style, incorporation of Jewish themes, and focus on social justice. My interest burgeoned when I met Bernarda Bryson Shahn in 1993 and discovered that we had attended the same high school in Columbus, Ohio, about 4 decades apart. Through talking with her, their son Jonathan, and others, and by studying his art, I came to appreciate what Ben once told his student, children's author and illustrator Tommy De Paula. Being an artist is not what you want, not only what you do, but also how you live your life. In addition to the people I interviewed, I am indebted to Lumilia Sholokova, then at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, Marissa Buryoin at the Smithsonian Institute, Janet Evans Brady at the Harvard University, Susan Edwards at the Friss Center for Visual Arts, Chris Glass of the Boston Public Library, Susan Wallner at NJN Public Television and Radio, and Chris Barton and Aaron Murphy, as well as my dear editor Emma Ledbetter, who was as a child attended a synagogue containing art installations by Shahn, her insightful assistant Sarah Sproul, and the brilliant Evan Turk. My children and grandchildren are as thoroughly splendid as ever. Illustrator's note. Ben Shahn has been one of my favorite artists for a long time. I even did a project on one of his Sacco and Vanzetti paintings when I was in 5th grade. I admire the bold shapes and rich textures he uses, as well as the very spontaneous and expressive way he drew people. He didn't try to create exact likenesses of people, but tried to capture the way they felt and exaggerated to help this tell the story more clearly. I wanted to bring a lot of his influence into the illustrations I made for this book. The paintings for this book were created mostly in gouache, a kind of opaque watercolor, with little bits of pencil, chalk, acrylic paint, and linoleum block printing. I also used a lot of masking tape to make the crisp lines and shapes. I always loved that Ben Shahn's paintings and told stories, and I think telling his story with paintings and Cynthia's beautiful words is a perfect tribute to one of the United States' most influential illustrators. And then we have a timeline.